Praise the Lord. Today we're going to read Acts chapter 27, 13 to 23. And the title of this is When God Takes Over. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands. Strake sail, and so were driven. And we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. Now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve. So here, basically, looking at certain things here within this text. Luke obviously is the writer, and sometimes he mentions we, and other times, or at least once, he mentions they. And so, in looking at verse number 17, when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands. Okay, so there was they in that particular verse, okay, again and again. But the other times he says we, and we, verse number 18, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest. And then verse number 19, and the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. So in part it was the crew members, they. Then in part it was possibly the majority of the people of the ship, but even including Luke and Paul and Andronicus, who was with them, that they had, that is Luke and Paul and Andronicus, had cast out with their own hands the tackling of the ship. So they were involved. Let's go to verse 13. It says, And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. So again, here, okay, so it's mentioned over and over again, the they. Verse number 13, they was referring to the crew members. But yet they was also the shipmaster. And of course, they had decided, they had that purpose of loosing from Crete, even though that Paul had warned them not to do so. The idea was for them to go ahead and sail further on to another location to the west of Crete, in Finis, in order to winter there. Thus, that was their purpose. Since it had stated that supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they were almost sure that they would be able to land at that destination which they had chosen. Even though that at the time the windy season had already arisen, therefore there was a threat. With that in mind, and the people on board, at least the majority, were in agreement with that choice to loose from Crete. They had loosed, or we can say started on their journey towards the west of Crete, even though it was not really a substantially long distance that they were going to travel, at least from their desire. They were going to get to a place called Phoenix, and it was only a distance of a day or two away, journeying. And even though that they were sailing close to land, it was not going to be enough to keep them on target. Yet, and of course, they would use the land at times, the islands, for a shield from the winds. Yet the south wind blew softly, which means that the wind was coming from the south at that time rather than the north. But it could be that the fierceness of the winds would come from the north. The south, it seemed like it blew softly, but when the northern winds started to blow, that was when it really shook. The softness of the wind was a good sign, but then it could change rapidly, and unfortunately, it did. There are some things in our lives that may be just the same, and we might figure out that everything is going well. And that journey may seem like this is fine, we're doing great, but just in a few short moments in this trip or in our life, things might just change drastically, and it can change in a particular day, in an hour, in a minute. You never know. Things may turn completely around and bring a lot of hardship. To make things even more sure, they had chosen to sail close by Crete, not veer off from it too far because that was a sure location, keeping the land in sight and making sure that they were close by it. They must have just sailed away from the shoreline of Crete, just enough for the ship to manage without any danger to it. That is, from the shoreline, they would not run into any shoreline at all, or the depth of the water was enough for them to be out that just enough depth for the ship to go on, and without any danger, supposedly from the winds that might be coming from the north. At least that is what they had imagined, and they thought that they would not veer off into the open Mediterranean Sea because that was where it was going to be worse. So they stayed along the coastline of Crete. And that was reasonable in the mind of people. Verse 14 says, "But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon." And the Euroclydon is almost like a hurricane wind style in the Mediterranean, even though that the wind speed can be 57 miles per hour, that is 92 kilometers per hour, or higher up. So it can be even faster than 57 miles per hour. And the worst possible storm in the Mediterranean, as far as I know, had come, and it was called Euroclydon. It packs wind of 57 miles per hour, 92 kilometers per hour, and can get up to hurricane type winds. It had lasted actually a couple of weeks. The one that had hit the ship that Paul, Luke, and Andronicus was on, and the others that were with them, were all going to suffer for quite some time. The thing about it is that it arose not long after they had loosed off from Crete to get there. They wanted to get their goal accomplished, even facing dangerous winds. However, even though they had set a goal, they were facing the dangerous situation. It took an advantage of them. They had never made it where they had destined to go. That is, the direction and the fact that they were going to winter in Crete. For people that may not listen to the voice of God, that may also be the case, especially when God has a plan for them. He speaks to them, but then they ignore it. Of course, one knows that there are people who set goals, and they arrive at those goals that are not people of God. But when the voice of God does speak to them, they should listen to his voice because there might be a warning up ahead. That is what is important, to know what is the voice of God and what it is saying to us. It may be a particular warning for us to go in a certain direction, not to stay somewhere or to stay somewhere. The reality is that those people who were on that ship, including the shipmaster and the others, except for Luke and those who knew Paul, probably did not know the voice of God. Paul was the only one, though, that had spoken up about the danger because it just might have been the voice of God that had spoken to him. He felt then impressed, no doubt, to warn them, and it was the opportunity, though, for God to do his work and show who he is, kind of like through Paul, to establish something that they could see that the hand of God was in it, even though that they would lose the tackling, they would lose a lot of, and the shipmaster would not be happy, but they would maintain their lives. And then they could believe by through what Paul had mentioned to them that they would not lose their lives, even though that they would lose the ship. It's kind of like a prophecy, and so they heard that, and it could lead them to believe in what Paul believed, that is, in Jesus Christ. Even though today, more than not, we should really have it by faith rather than by sight, but some people do need to have a miracle so that they can see the hand of God in it. It is by God's miraculous powers that many have come to the Lord Jesus. And Paul was leading them in a way to Jesus by the warning and by the messages that he had mentioned to them. In verse number 15, it says, "And when the ship was caught, could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive." It mentions the fact that the ship was caught. How did the ship get caught? Was it because it got caught against the rocks and couldn't move? Was it something in the water? Was the ground too close to the ship so that it could not journey on? No, it was caught in the fierceness of the winds. The winds were driving it away from their direct course that they wished to take. Some winds of this world may drive us off course too, and we are on the pathway to heaven and following Jesus. We may have a goal in mind, but then there are winds of the enemy, so to speak, which may drive us away from the true way or goal that we have in our mind for our well being and for those that are Christians for our spirituality, or even a goal of success. Yet the winds of this world or the winds of the enemy that are contrary to us may try their best to get us off course. The idea is to keep on course, keep us focused on our goal, keep our focus on Jesus Christ. One should note that those physical winds, which might even have a light in the spiritual, was in Paul's life getting nearer to the time that he would pass away. It is said that he died roughly 64 to 65 AD. The trip on the ship to Rome was, according to what I found on the internet, 59 to 60 AD. Then that meant that he had basically only 4 to 6 years of life left when those winds had struck the ship. For Paul, that did not stop his faith in Jesus. In fact, it might have even strengthened it. It may have influenced even some of the people on board about Paul's message and confidence when they had gotten to the island and Paul's message of Jesus Christ. In other words, they were shipwrecked on the island, and then Paul was able to to share not only with them, but also with the people of the island. Therefore, it was a God thing. God was working in that for him to testify to those people of the ship and also to the people of the island. And therefore, whenever we get, the God can work out things in his way to present opportunities for the gospel message to be preached and to be shown to the people that are um, unbelievers, at least at first, so that they can change their minds and believe in Jesus. When the ship could not be moved to the direction that they wanted, they allowed the ship to go where it would. It's like, we can't handle this ship. It's so stubborn. The winds are going to take it where the winds are going to take it. That must have been about 2 weeks or so, about 2 weeks. But it was grand that they had actually come to an island, and it must have been also the plan of God for them to get to that particular island. In verse number 16, it says, "And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat." Now, this island was only 23 miles away from Crete. They had only traveled by, I guess you could say, the wind to that island, but they did not stay in the island. They did not even get off the boat. It was just an island they were near. So the distance from Clauda to Crete, where they had come from, was about 23 miles. It seems that the winds had further driven them from that island, also from Clauda all the way to Melita or Malta, which was, in a sense, kind of the direction that they were headed. So they needed not even per se to steer the ship, but they had to let it go with the winds. And so Melita is the name in Greek at that time. It was named that. Malta is the more modern name. Yet with only the 23 miles that they had driven away from Crete to about the island of Clauda, here it is stated that they had a lot of work to do for the ship, and that was to prevent it from any damage. They needed to undergird the ship, which meant that the ship needed to get strengthened, supported, and secured from underneath the ship itself. When Luke had it written that they had much work to come by, one wonders whether Paul and even the ones in custody, the prisoners, were helping out at the time too, or whether they were not. One wonders if all of the people on board were helping in one way or another. Obviously, since it concerned their lives, they had probably helped in one way or another. Yet, since the ones in custody were in custody, this is a question, not chained up due to the circumstances that they were in, or were they still chained up? So, these are certain questions regarding their safety as well, and whether they could help to make sure that the ship needed to get everything done to it. Verse number 17 says, "Which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven." Well, maybe here, because in verse 17 it says they, it was talking about the crew members and those that were working for the shipmaster. That it started with they, but then went to we. So they were doing all they could, but then when they did all they could, then it started with the we, meaning that the rest of the people could also lend a hand. Those that were workers on the ship and the shipmaster must have viewed the quicksands, and must have been also that they were not that far off either. So they were worried much about it. Thus, they had tried their best to undergird the ship, helping the ship to remain away from the quicksands and to secure the boat the best that they could have. The helps noted here refers to, according to Eliot's commentary for English readers, means that they had traversed cables under the ships, under the ship itself, in order to have the ship's planks be stabilized, even doing so during the mighty storm that they were already in at that present. In addition, we can say, regarding the quicksands, as it is noted, they may be called sandbars that are near the African coast, of which they presumed that they would fall into and lose the ship itself, possibly even their lives. Thus, they had to strike sail in order to avoid such a situation or confrontation. To strike sail meant that they put up the sail, at least something, but not probably all. The quicksands, two of them, you had the greater, you had the lesser, which were called Syrtis, Acertus, or something like this. And many a ship had fallen prey to those quicksands or sandbars, and it brought them much fear, not only the storm itself, but also the idea of getting caught in such quicksands. In verse number 18, it says, "And we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. It seems that all night long they were struggling with such, and being totally exhausted and working round the clock without any rest at all. Furthermore, they could not expect any food during that time. In addition, as it states, they had been tossed with a tempest. The Euroclydon was tossing them here and there for a particular period of about 2 weeks. It is simple to just write about something and think back after it had happened to the people. But reality can strike a person while they are going through it. It came upon them suddenly, and it was almost like death staring them in the face, ready to take them down. Of course, Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus were believers in Jesus and had probably believed those things that Paul had mentioned. So they were not in fear, quote unquote, for their lives. The others may have had quite a bit of fear, especially when they did not believe the things that Paul had mentioned. The question might be, did they have any women or children on board? They would have been, of course, the most fearful, but even the men had a fear due to the strength of the winds, the waves, and the threat of going into the sandbars and be tossed at sea, which would have been a loss of the ship and the loss of lives. Therefore, in order to help with the ship's direction and being able to maneuver the ship more easily, they had decided to lighten the ship, for it was tough to work with it all around. Obviously, it was the cost of a lot of things for the ship that the shipmaster had to get rid of. And in such days, there was probably not anything in regards to insurance for the ship, for that was more modern day thing. However, there was such a thing as bottomry, and even the imperial treasury could have absorbed the losses for such things as grain transport as they were shipping. So the shipmaster may not have been at a total loss. In verse number 19, it says, "And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship." Here, what is interesting also is the fact that Luke had mentioned the we when he mentioned getting rid of the tackling of the ship. Thus, it kind of hints towards him and the others also working together to get rid of the ship tackling. They seemed to be getting rid of more and more as the days had passed. It was beneficial, they had thought, in order to control the ship much more easily. Then the ship would not be so heavy and go its own way with the winds. But with getting rid of some of the weight of the ship, then the sail could bear it more with the added pressure of the winds. In verse number 20 it says, "When neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. In sailing, one expects a certain time period in order to arrive at a destination. However, since they were quote unquote drifting, so to speak, they had been wandering. It is true that they had no idea actually of when they were going to get to their destination. It states that when neither sun nor stars had appeared for many days, they had basically lost hope in being saved. However, again, Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus did not have their hope taken from them. It can be said, though, that they had probably wished the ordeal would have been over already, for it was taken so long and it really had tested their patience throughout the ordeal. It was not only the fact the tempest was grand and threatening to them, but it was also the fact that they did not have sun nor stars in their journey as they had wished or realized that the situation that it was so dreadful and that suffering that without getting food, without getting rest, or at least little rest. In verse number 21, it says, "But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, to have gained this harm and loss." So here already he's talking about long abstinence. But actually, he did not say that. That's what the word says. But after long abstinence, he starts at sirs. Sirs is where he starts. Ye should have hearkened unto me, bringing back the fact that he had mentioned to them not to leave, but they did leave anyway. Paul had finally wished to stand forth to speak to them all. It was not just after a moment or so, but it states that it had been after, quote, long abstinence. That means that during the entire journey from Crete, the moment that they had set forward and the winds began so harshly, pounding severely upon the ship, not one of the men that was trying to help the ship towards its journey had eaten. One wonders as well the time that they had no sleep either. For how could one sleep when basically all hands on deck was actually needed? Thus, they had lost their sleep. They were weakened by fasting, not eating a single thing. It could be a question, how much water were they able to drink? Paul, in standing up, gave them some reassurance of their journey, that they would all make it with their lives intact. He did reprove them, though, a bit of not listening to his advice in not removing themselves from Crete. He didn't think that it was a good idea. Because they had removed themselves from Crete, even though they were warned not to, it did cause them all quite a bit, as it states, quote, harm and loss, end quote. In regards to getting rid of the, quote, tackling, end quote, of the ship, that may have also referred to even the personal belongings of the people. It required getting rid of a lot of extra non-essentials of the ship and of the people that could weigh down the ship. Yet all of the people would be, in essence, saved from drowning and from being tossed or lost at sea. In verse number 22, it says, "And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship." After hearing Paul's speech, the shipmaster was probably not so delighted to hear of the loss of the ship. However, that was God's plan from the time that they had loosed from Crete. And actually, God's plan from the beginning. Paul, though, had essentially said that each one of them should be of good cheer, for they would be saved from death, for no one, he stated, would lose their lives. Paul had said that it was an angel that had given him that idea as God's messenger. Paul was not getting revenge on any of the people, nor of the shipmaster, for them believing the shipmaster and not God or him, but he was just telling them the truth of what was going to happen to the ship. He was just saying that they should have listened to him, but he was not in the business of getting revenge on anyone at all. Some may have taken that to heart, meaning that they might have felt a little bit offended by giving them the truth and not having them listen from the outset. However, Paul just mentioned that they should have listened to him, but what will happen even further on shall give them more reason to believe in the same God that Paul believes in. And whether or not they changed, we don't know. In verse number 23, it says, "For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve." This angel that had visited Paul instead of Jesus Christ this time was by Paul during the nighttime. However, the fact is that the angel, not one to provide the angel's name, but the truth is that the angel had given good news to Paul and essentially to those who were in the ship. It was only because Paul was in the ship that this good news had come to them. The angel might have been only seen by Paul, not by the rest of the crew, even though that they were working very well on managing the ship and its direction, and even possibly working during the time that the angel of God had come to Paul. In any case, their direction was not that way off of where they were headed, anyhow. So it was all in the control and in the hand of God. And basically, we can say our lives are the same way. We're in the hand of God. Yet we may face obstacles, we may face troubles, we may face serious problems, but our lives are in the hand of God. And if we put our life in His hands, He will direct us in the right direction. And we will get to our destination and heaven when He is in control and when He is guiding and when He is doing the work. May God bless you in Jesus' name. Amen.